19 million years ago, a creature roamed the African landscape that defies every biological category you have ever studied. It bore no resemblance to a mammoth, a mastodon, or any elephant species currently inhabiting our planet, while it possessed a trunk. This appendage did not curl upward in the familiar fashion. Instead, it hung straight down, functioning like a heavy-duty, curved tool engineered for something brutal and precise. With a single tug, this hook-like snout could strip the bark clean from a trunk. That is merely the prologue. Across that same continent, during the very same era, elephants thrived that sported 4 tusks, not 2. Meanwhile, saber-toothed cats prowled the shadows, armed with canine fangs measuring nearly 7 inches in length, sufficiently massive to puncture the resilient hide of prey, weighing upwards of 30,000 pounds. The ecosystem that bound these titans together remains entirely unlike anything present on Earth today. These were not evolutionary anomalies. They were the absolute monarchs of ancient Africa, dominant apex predators that held sway for millions of years. They lived, battled, competed, and flourished. Eventually, however, they faded away one by one, until they were gone. For the next half hour, we are traveling backward. We are returning to a version of Africa that remains virtually unknown to most. A realm teeming with giants and predators, built upon an ecosystem so intricate that its collapse spanned millions of years. Once this video concludes, your perspective on modern elephants will be forever altered. Shall we begin? To comprehend these beasts, you must first grasp the environment they occupied. That world bore absolutely no resemblance to the Africa we recognize today. We are exploring the Miocene epoch, approximately 19 million years ago. If you were granted the ability to soar over the African continent at that precise moment, you would fail to identify a single landmark. The Sahara Desert? It was non-existent, in the place of endless, sun-baked sand and fractured earth. You would instead behold a dense, moisture-laden rainforest stretching across thousands of miles. Canopies soared up to 130 feet into the air, and rivers were vast enough to engulf entire valleys. Sunlight could barely penetrate the floor, blocked by walls of foliage so dense that waterfalls cascaded through them like curtains. The climate was perpetually warm and humid. Imagine the Amazon rainforest on its most stifling, muggy day. Rainfall was not a seasonal occurrence, but a constant, month after month reality. Water was abundant, and it was never in short supply. The sheer volume of vegetation was staggering. We are not describing sparse grasslands or thin shrubbery. We are talking about a continent draped in flora, so lush and towering that massive creatures could vanish into its depths. Certain grass species reached such heights that a 12-foot animal positioned in the middle of a clearing would be unable to spot another beast just 20 feet away. One did not have to hunt for sustenance. Food was simply present, offered in limitless quantities in every direction. This abundance is critical, as it dictated the evolutionary path of every species living there. When water remains ever present and food is ubiquitous, nature does not prioritize efficiency. Instead, it favors massive scale. It rewards extreme specialization, encouraging organisms to commit to a singular survival strategy and refine it over millions of years. That is exactly what transpired during the Miocene. Africa was partitioned into overlapping ecological territories, thick rainforests lining the coasts and river basins, immense verdant savannas unfolding through the interior, and fertile floodplains in the south, constantly rejuvenated by slow-moving rivers saturated with nutrients and sediment. Each distinct ecological zone hosted its own unique cast of creatures, governed by its own set of rules. Naturally, every one of these habitats would eventually succumb to its own narrative of collapse. Yet in this present era of abundance, one biological group stood head and shoulders above the rest: the proboscideans, These trunk bearers formed a family so strikingly diverse, bizarre, and dominant that, at certain points in history, multiple species were found vying for the same forested landscapes simultaneously. Of all these wonders, the one that routinely causes paleontologists to trail off in mid-sentence was already present, already foraging, and already ruling. It was called Deinotherium. You are likely misimagining it. The name itself is derived from the ancient Greek dinos, meaning terrible, and therion, meaning beast. When 19th century scientists first reconstructed its skeleton from fossilized remains, they weren't being hyperbolic, they were simply being precise, however. We must first dispel a widespread misconception. Deinotherium was not an ancestor of our modern-day elephants. That is a common assumption, but it is entirely incorrect. Rather, Deinotherium represented a distinct branch of the evolutionary tree, an independent experiment conducted by nature in parallel. While it may bear a superficial resemblance to an elephant, the more closely you examine its biology, the more alien it appears. Consider its dimensions, which are difficult for the human mind to fully grasp. A mature Deinotherium stood roughly 13 feet high at the shoulder. For perspective, the largest African elephants living today reach that stature only on their absolute best day. And even then, those are the outliers. Deinotherium achieved such height as a matter of routine. Some fossils suggest certain individuals may have even approached 14 or 15 feet, though this remains a point of contention among experts. Estimates place its weight between 22,003 pounds, roughly 10 to 14 tons. To translate that into relatable terms, imagine stacking 5 fully grown hippos or 25 average cars on top of each other. Were this creature to stand beside a standard school bus, its back would align perfectly with the roofline. Yet, its sheer bulk is not what defines its strangeness, rather, its trunk does. Every elephant we recognize today possesses a trunk that extends forward, curling downward slightly at the extremity, flexible, prehensile, and utilized for grasping, spraying, and sensory communication. It acts effectively as a secondary hand. Conversely, the trunk of the Deinotherium was entirely unique. It hung directly downward from the face, dropping in a near vertical line like a thick rope tethered to the base of the skull. Rather than curving outward, at the tip of this appendage sat 2 tusks that curved downward, jutting out from the lower jaw instead of the upper. They did not point forward or outward like those of typical proboscideans, but rather aimed downward and slightly toward the rear. When fossil hunters first unearthed the Deinotherium skull, they initially assembled it upside down, as the tusk arrangement was completely baffling in any other orientation. That is how deeply counterintuitive its anatomy was. Why the vertical trunk? Why the reversed tusks? The explanation lies in a highly specialized feeding strategy that Deinotherium refined over millions of years. It did not consume fruit, nor did it browse the upper canopy like a giraffe. Instead, its diet consisted primarily of thick, fibrous, and incredibly tough tree bark that most other animals were unable to process. Furthermore, it fed heavily on roots pulled from the earth and on fallen timber, scavenging decomposing wood to extract nutrients and fungi. Its downward-hanging trunk acted as a combination of lever and hook. By pressing against a tree's base, it used its tusks to dig beneath a sheet of bark, which was then peeled away in long, efficient strips with a single upward heave. This was a clean, specialized method unlike anything else in that ecosystem. By carving out this specific niche, Deinotherium avoided competition, accessing vital nutrition that every other herbivore simply ignored. Estimates suggest that to sustain such massive body mass, an adult Deinotherium required roughly 2,200 pounds of sustenance daily. This was no exaggeration. It meant the creature spent nearly all its waking hours in a state of slow, methodical, and relentless feeding, moving through the forests like a biological harvester, hour after hour, tree after tree. Evidence from fossil sites containing multiple remains indicates that Deinotherium lived in small, matriarchal herds, likely 5 to 15 individuals, where older females directed key movements, including water access and group migration. Young males, upon reaching maturity, were relegated to the periphery of the herd, traveling in loose bachelor groups until they were powerful enough to vie for dominance. When two mature males engaged in combat, the skirmishes were serious and physical. With tusks used as weapons to knock opponents off balance, these were not lethal duels, but injuries were common in a world teeming with predators. Any wounded animal was a vulnerable one above all. Deinotherium was utterly reliant on water. Despite its ability to process dry bark and tough flora, it required massive daily hydration, hundreds of gallons over a weekly period. Ecologists categorize it as a water-dependent species, as it could not survive more than a few days' journey from a reliable source. Its entire range, migration patterns, and life cycle were tethered to lakes, rivers, and seasonal floodplains. This singular dependence on water will prove to be the most critical detail in this entire chronicle. Keep it in your mind. Before we proceed, I must introduce you to a creature from this same ecosystem that manages to be even more bizarre than Deinotherium. Deinotherium was far from the only proboscidean patrolling that continent. It shared the African landscape with an array of other trunk-bearing cousins, evolutionary experiments, and ecological rivals. One of these creatures possessed a physical trait so bizarre that you might assume I am exaggerating, yet I assure you I am not. This animal was known as Gomphotherium. Rather than the standard 2, Gomphotherium sported 4 tusks. 2 were positioned on the upper jaw in traditional elephantine fashion, while an additional pair extended straight out from the lower jaw, resembling a set of shovels bolted onto its face. 4 tusks were simultaneously functional on a single animal. Let us analyze the implications of such anatomy for a living being navigating a dense forest, measuring roughly 8 to 11 feet in height and weighing between 18,000 and 22,000 pounds. Gomphotherium was smaller than Deinotherium, while still massive by modern standards. It was notably more agile and lighter than its giant neighbor. Where Deinotherium remained a specialist restricted to bark and roots, Gomphotherium functioned as a generalist. Its diet included fruit, aquatic vegetation, soft greens, and leaves. Those lower tusks appear to have served as shovels or scoops, allowing the beast to unearth water plants along riverbanks and harvest low-lying foliage through a sweeping, lateral motion. The prevailing scientific theory posits that this 4-tusked arrangement granted Gomphotherium a significant mechanical advantage while feeding in muddy or aquatic terrain, effectively enabling the animal to exploit resources buried in soft earth or submerged below the waterline. While researchers continue to debate the precise extent of these tusks' utility, the structure itself is well supported by fossil evidence. Practically speaking, this niche specialization allowed Gomphotherium and Deinotherium to occupy the same regions without engaging in constant competition for sustenance. In effect, nature had partitioned the menu. One animal claimed the trees, while the other held dominion over the riverbanks. Furthermore, a third species, Stegodon, occupied an entirely separate lane. Being smaller and arguably the most conventional in appearance, Stegodon featured a single pair of tusks that ran almost perfectly parallel, pointing straight forward and creating a streamlined profile. As a browser feeding on leaves, grass, and tender vegetation, Stegodon was significantly more adaptable to fluctuating conditions than either of its relatives. This flexibility would eventually grant it more time, though not indefinitely. Visualize this food web. At the base lay millions of acres of plant life, roots, trees, and aquatic flora providing essentially limitless energy for these massive herbivores. Within the middle tier, Deinotherium, Gomphotherium, and Stegodon each drew from distinct segments of that fuel supply, keeping direct conflict manageable. High above them, observing and calculating, were the predators. The apex carnivore of this ecosystem was a saber-toothed felid. This was not the famous Smilodon associated with the Americas, but rather an earlier African relative from the same lineage. Built upon identical, brutal design principles, it was muscular, large, and possessed the deadly canine teeth we shall examine momentarily. The remarkable stability of this system is what fascinates. 3 species of giant herbivores coexisted on a single continent without resulting in mutual annihilation. This was achieved not through peacefulness, but through distinctness. Every species had staked out its own ecological role, habitat, and food source, while competition occurred. Specialization served to mitigate it. The environment was sufficiently vast, rich, and productive to sustain them all simultaneously. It stood as one of the most complex, high-performing large mammal ecosystems in planetary history. And it appeared permanent, virtually unbreakable. It was not, despite the raw, staggering power contained within that 30,000-pound frame. Deinotherium was never secure. Safety was an illusion in this ecosystem. For prowling through those same forests, lapping from the same rivers, and resting beneath the shadows of the same trees, was an entity that had spent millions of years evolving for one specific objective: the slaughter of megafauna. While the saber-toothed felids of Miocene Africa are not as well documented in popular culture as their later cousins, they were undeniably apex predators, measuring 7 to 8 feet from snout to tail and weighing between 330 and 550 pounds. They were heavier than modern lions and built with greater muscularity in the shoulders and forelimbs. By sitting lower to the ground, they were designed not for sustained pursuit, but for explosive, short-range ambushes. Then, there were the fangs. These canines measured nearly 7 inches curved, serrated blades sharp enough to puncture through inches of muscle and hide in one stroke. When the jaw was agape, these teeth dominated the front of the skull, with every other facial feature serving merely to support and deliver these 2 instruments of death. Paleontologists have debated for decades how a 400-pound cat managed to fell an animal 60 times its own weight. The most likely answer is that they did not hunt alone. Fossil findings at various sites indicate these felids operated in coordinated groups, likely ranging from 3 to 8 individuals. According to reconstructions based on bone damage patterns and kill sites, their strategy never involved attacking the strongest member of the herd. Instead, they isolated the vulnerable, the calf, or the elderly individual lagging behind, perhaps already weakened by illness or injury. Efficiency, not caution, drove this behavior, as energy squandered on a failed hunt could prove fatal in a world where meals were not guaranteed. Imagine the hunt. It is late afternoon, and a Deinotherium herd grazes beneath a golden canopy spread across a quarter-mile of forest, focused entirely on harvesting roots and bark. A calf, perhaps 2 years old and already the size of a large horse, has wandered 40 or 50 feet away from the nearest adult. It feels no alarm, for nothing in its brief life has ever suggested it should. Motionless and downwind, the felids have been monitoring the group for over an hour. Then movement. It is not a slow buildup, it is an explosion. One predator launches from concealment in a full sprint, traversing 30 feet in under 2 seconds, slamming into the calf's side with claws extended to force it off balance. Simultaneously, a second felid is already surging from the opposite angle. The calf lets out a piercing shriek, a sound distinct from that of a modern elephant calf, yet sufficiently evocative for the nearby adults to instantly recognize it as a distress call. The subsequent 15 seconds are decisive. The mother does not approach the commotion with tentative caution. Her reaction is instantaneous and ferocious. She launches herself into a charge, all 25,000 pounds of her traversing the ground, with a velocity that defies the expectations one might have for such a massive beast. Her trunk, wielded like a heavy flail, swings with deadly intent. Her objective is not merely to deter the predators, but to annihilate them when cornered or acting in defense of their young. Deinotherium almost certainly ranked among the most lethal animals in the entire ecosystem. It was not that they were hunters, rather, the simple reality is that such immense mass, fueled by pure, unbridled aggression, produces catastrophic consequences. A solitary strike from that trunk could shatter a rib cage, while a single swipe of a tusk could result in a fatality. The felids understand this. The knowledge has either been inherited or earned through bitter experience. Consequently, the outcome is entirely dictated by timing. If the mother arrives before the calf is incapacitated, provided the youngling remains upright during those vital, fleeting seconds, the predators invariably abandon the hunt. They slip back into the underbrush long before the rest of the herd can gather. They will simply attempt the hunt again on another day, or perhaps target a different group. They possess the luxury of patience. For the forest is teeming with herds, however. If the strike is delivered with precision, if the calf is felled hard, and the mother arrives even 5 seconds too late, the calf will never regain its footing. This represents natural selection in its most visceral form. Only those calves born to vigilant mothers, raised within tightly knit groups, and strong enough to remain close to the herd, are destined for survival. Those individuals that wander off, or those born to inexperienced or inattentive mothers, or perhaps those slightly smaller or slower than the norm, become the sustenance for the predators. Those specific calves ultimately fail to propagate their genetic line across countless millennia. This selective pressure silently refines the Deinotherium population, prioritizing alertness, maternal ferocity, and herd cohesion. The predator does not merely consume the prey, it actively sculpts it. Yet, there exists another dimension to this relationship that is frequently overlooked. The saber-toothed felids were not independent of Deinotherium, they were tethered to it. By specializing one's entire physiological structure muscle, skull, teeth, and anatomy around hunting a specific category of megafauna, one is effectively placing a long-term, all-in evolutionary wager that these creatures will endure forever. For millions of years, that bet paid dividends. Deinotherium was abundant, reliable, and pervasive. The predators prospered for the sole reason that their prey prospered. Nevertheless, a gamble that yields rewards for 10 million years can still conclude in total bankruptcy. It simply takes longer for the loss to manifest. Simultaneously, Deinotherium faced pressures beyond mere predation, for the herds were also locked in internal competition. As population densities climbed within particularly lush areas, different Deinotherium factions inevitably converged upon identical waterholes and fertile forest groves. Such encounters were far from tranquil. Mature bulls from opposing groups would engage in grueling, prolonged confrontations, involving trunk grappling, tusk striking, and intense displays of raw, pushing power. While these weren't territorial, in a strictly rigid sense, fixed boundaries likely weren't defended. The privilege of accessing the highest quality resources remained inextricably linked to strength, size, and the tenacity to fight. The largest herds, guided by the most seasoned matriarchs, secured the right to drink first, graze first, and dictate the pace of movement. Everything else was forced to accommodate them for millions of years. This was the established order, savage and sometimes inequitable, but enduringly, remarkably stable, that was, until the world beneath them began to shift in silence. Millions of years unfolded, generation after generation, Deinotherium, Stegodon, Gomphotherium, and the saber-toothed felids all flourished. Adapted and competed, the rains remained consistent, the forests verdant, and the rivers deep. Then, roughly 5 million years ago, a transition commenced. It was not sudden or cataclysmic. It consisted of minor adjustments, subtle omens that only become apparent when viewing the span of thousands of years. Global temperatures began to recede, dropping by 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit over a protracted period. While such a shift may seem negligible, when sustained across a continent for hundreds of thousands of years, it represents the divide between a rainforest and a grassland, or between a perennial river and a riverbed that lies arid for half the year. Rainfall became sporadic, then unreliable, before largely ceasing. The forests began to recede at first slowly, thinning at the fringes, then with increasing haste. The vast, humid rainforests that had blanketed the continent for tens of millions of years were forced to retreat toward the coastlines. In their wake, scrubland, open woodland, and early savannas began to emerge. The flora that had underpinned the existence of Deinotherium, the root systems, the fallen timber, and the trees with thick, fibrous bark were disappearing with relentless, steady persistence. For Deinotherium, the mathematical reality turned brutal. An animal requiring 2,200 pounds of food daily cannot pivot its dietary needs overnight. That dependency is ingrained within its very biology, including its metabolic rate, gut capacity, and the massive weight it must sustain. The consequences were immediate when the food supply dwindled by 20 or 30%. Physical conditions plummeted. Pregnant females suffered miscarriages, and calves were born too frail to endure. The herds began to dwindle. Dependence on water exacerbated every woe as rivers contracted. Groups that once roamed freely across vast distances were compressed into narrower corridors, resulting in overcrowded, lethal competition around the few remaining water sources. Predictably, the saber-toothed felids found themselves ensnared in that same cascading collapse as Deinotherium herds diminished. The prey population upon which those predators relied became increasingly unpredictable. Hunts were thwarted with greater frequency, leading to starvation among the cubs. Consequently, the predator population entered a state of decline in perfect synchronization with their prey, a gradual, inexorable cascade that neither group possessed the means to halt. Gomphotherium was the first to succumb. Its specific apparatus, perfectly calibrated for foraging riverine vegetation, rendered it obsolete as the landscape grew arid. Stegodon managed to endure for a longer duration, as its dietary versatility served as its primary advantage. Ultimately, however, it too lost the struggle on the African mainland. Deinotherium represented the final holdout, having navigated lesser climatic shifts in the past. It possessed a history of resilience, yet, on this occasion, the forests failed to recover, fragmented, isolated, and forced into dense clusters around the remaining water sources. The final populations eventually exhausted their last options. No volcanic eruption or asteroid impact brought this end, rather. The world simply transformed more rapidly than a highly specialized organism could keep pace with. Then, silence descended. The peculiar downward curving trunk no longer navigated the undergrowth alone. Pristine sheets of stripped bark ceased to be produced. Nothing remained save for fossils, slowly mineralizing within the sediment. The moral of this history is far from subtle. The very trait that served as Deinotherium's greatest asset, its extreme specialization and total dedication to a singular niche, became the precise factor that rendered it helpless once that niche vanished. It had successfully optimized itself into a cul-de-sac. When that corner was effectively removed, there was no path remaining. Specialization is certainly not an evolutionary defect for millions of years. It acted as a superpower. Nevertheless, it carries a hidden liability. one that only emerges when the global environment shifts and the invoice is finally presented. Deinotherium, Gomphotherium, Stegodon, and the saber-toothed felids. These four lineages dominated Africa for eons. They were successful by every metric nature applies. Powerful and highly adapted, yet each one of them has vanished. Their extinction was not triggered by misfortune or a singular cataclysm, rather. The environment they were engineered to inhabit gradually ceased to exist, and they lacked the ability to track that change to a new reality. At this moment, Africa is undergoing yet another transformation. Temperatures across the continent are climbing more rapidly than the global average, and precipitation patterns are becoming erratic. Rivers that have flowed for millennia are receding. The contemporary fauna, lions, rhinos, and African elephants are currently experiencing a version of those same pressures that decimated the Deinotherium 5 million years ago. Diminishing water, shrinking food supplies, restricted mobility, and heightened competition for what remains are their new realities. Can they evolve with enough speed to survive? We simply do not know. Evolutionary progress typically occurs across thousands of generations. But the current velocity of climate shift is compressing that timeline in a manner rarely observed within the fossil record. What the evidence inscribed across Africa confirms is this: when the environment transitions faster than biology can respond, even the most dominant species are denied a second chance. Deinotherium did not elect to go extinct, nor did it fail to struggle. It simply lacked the time to survive in a world that had moved on without it. No final valiant stand was made. There was no epic battle. It was merely a slow fading herd by herd, generation by generation, until the forest stood empty and remained so. That is the facet of this chronicle that lingers with me, not the physical scale, nor the bizarre anatomy of the trunk, but the absolute quietude of the conclusion. If you appreciate these explorations of evolutionary cul-de-sacs, extinct lineages, and the more enigmatic chapters of natural history, ensure you subscribe so that you don't miss our next installment. Leave a comment below. Which of these animals did you find the most surprising? I make it a point to read every single one. Until next time,